Okay, so we're starting off each session today with a mission moment to highlight ways that together with our members, we're strengthening literacy across the state. And I am so excited to introduce Wisconsin Literacy's Director of Program Compliance and Product Strategy, Anna Beer, who will be sharing information about the importance of data for this session's mission moment. Thanks, Anna.
Sure. So if you were in the last session, you heard Jake talk a bit about the importance of data and sharing your information. Oh, just one moment. One quick moment. I want to check something. Okay, great. I just hot off the presses got permission to use something, and so I want to make sure that I get that in my slide here. So give me just one moment. You can all stretch. I know it's the afternoon here, so all right. Let me see if it's going to show up. Perfect. Okay, so let me start over again. So if you were in the last session, Jake was talking about the importance of telling your story. And that was one of the lessons he's learned in his years of working in adult education. And so I'm going to talk a bit about some details about that sharing your data and sharing your stories. And the planning committee for this conference asked me to talk about this because many of you, if you are a Wisconsin Literacy member, have recently completed your demographic survey. And we know that we as an organization ask you to collect and report a lot of data, and that this can be really time consuming and takes resources to collect and report data. But it is so useful. And we also want to make sure you know that it is used. So we do take the data that you share with us. So real quickly here, data matters because it moves your work from anecdotal to provable. So like if you had a story about Bob getting a car, that activates feelings in your stakeholders. But data that 30 people got their driver's license will help your stakeholders really see themselves in the story and the impact that they have and that they can make. And we're going to talk about using both of those together too. You build trust with your stakeholders. And then it can also be really helpfully internally for identifying what's working and what's not, and help you drive decisions about programs, staffing, and funding. So here's just a hot off the presses number 2 from our demographic survey. Uh, our membership served over 14,600 students in the last year. So your data really matters in us telling the story. So Wisconsin Literacy advocates for support with your data. And together we give our students a statewide voice. And so Wisconsin Literacy uses this information with government agencies and corporate sponsorships. I pulled this from, this is just an image from a previous impact report that we serve. So this information, this statewide data is so important for us when we talk to our statewide stakeholders. There are different types of data you can use. So you can use quantitative data like test scores, attendance, completion rates and numbers. You can report on hours of instruction that happens within your programs and the number of students that you serve. You can also use qualitative data. So sharing student testimonials, the teacher or volunteer feedback, and stories of transformation. So it's really important that you're using both of these things, both the qualitative and the quantitative story to tell, or data to tell your story. And how can you use this data? You can use it to evaluate your programs. Um, Maybe we've seen a steady decrease in adult literacy learners in our program. So think about what's going on there. And then this will help you guide your strategy, maybe planning staffing, outreach, resources, help you see changes and trends that you need to examine further to help you learn. And then externally, it helps you communicate your impact. It gives a clear picture to your stakeholders of what's going on what they can't see every day in your program. So it kind of gives them a peek behind the curtain as what's happening within your program. And so then here, I'd want to show you that data doesn't always have to look pretty. So this is something that we as a Wisconsin literacy staff received earlier today from our data and communications manager. This is an image showing the coverage that our programs have over the state of Wisconsin and how we serve 93.5% of the people statewide. And so again, this is just a quick, he didn't necessarily have time to put together a pretty graphic, but this is showing us internally as a staff, this is impact that our programs have. I wanted to point out a really important resource that we have on our website about statistics. So if you go to the Wisconsin Literacy website, and you'll have a link to this when you get a copy of the slides, this statistics page has a variety of different statewide resources in here. So you'll see literacy statistics in Wisconsin. But if you scroll down, you will find a national study that gives us information that you can find county level detail. And so here, if you click on the U.S. Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, or PIAC, that skills map, you can actually go into different counties within the state of Wisconsin or any place in the country and find both the literacy and numeracy rates for that county. And this can be very helpful in telling your story to your communities as far as the need for services. And then you want to turn your impact into evidence. So how do you do that? Start collecting your most important data points. Share these results with your board, your funders, and volunteers. And also, within your programs to do that evaluation. And then use your data story to fuel your next grant application. Well, thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Well, now we are just thrilled to have Nick Curran, the founder and CEO of Numbers for Nonprofits, presenting today. Nick has been involved in public accounting since 1998. He shifted his focus to provide specialized accounting services to nonprofit organizations in 2006. He leads the Numbers for Nonprofits team in preparing nonprofits for annual audits, assisting with annual budgeting, creating forward-focused financial projections, and offering vital outside perspective. Nick is active in AICPA, WICPA, Downtown Madison Rotary, Tocqueville Society of United Way of Dane County. He was recognized in Business Magazine's 40 Under 40 and was part of Leadership Greater Madison 14. Nick is proud to be a 2022 Ironman Wisconsin finisher, and he enjoys spending time with family and friends, traveling, and cheering on the Packers and Badgers. Thanks so much, Nick. I will pass it off to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I just got to get my screen share going up here and we'll get started. Please ask questions as we go along here. If anything pops out and you want clarification on anything as we go, somebody's going to help me monitor the chat as we go, and I'll be happy to answer those as we go along, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end as well. So let's see, let's get to the next. There we go. So Kimberly gave a little bit of this information, just a little bit more about why I'm up in front of you all. So I cut my teeth with nonprofits at Williams Young, which merged into Wipfli in about 2004. So spent time traveling the country with grant-funded organizations, and learned a lot of nonprofit accounting that way. I became self-employed in 2004, and I've been working with nonprofits pretty exclusively since 2006. Numbers for nonprofits were a 36 member team, working with about 150 nonprofits throughout the country at this point. So my philosophy when it comes to budgeting is that everybody should start their budgeting process with a zero-based approach. So what that means is instead of like looking at last year's budget and going, oh, it's going to be the same because we're the same operation, reverse the process and start at zero and add items in rather than using last year's budget. It's a time for reflection on what is important to fulfilling our mission. Use some historical perspective while asking what do we want to do this year versus last year, and it requires input from all areas of the organization. So you're going to have to talk with finance and development and programs and admin just to make sure everybody's had some input on what they need in order to do the work that you all are doing in the communities. Any questions on a zero-based approach? All right, I see Shannon giving me the head nod. All right, so we certainly want to understand our revenues, and I probably should have shifted these around in my deck a little bit, but let's talk about revenues because it is at the top of most of our nonprofit budgets. So we need to understand our grants, and probably most important is what type of grants do we have? There are grants that we get that are donor restricted. So, somebody might say, okay, I'm going to give you $100,000 to help people get their driver's license. And, you've submitted a budget to that organization that says, okay, we're going to use the $50,000 salaried person with 25% benefit fringe, and then some additional costs over a 12 or 24-month period. We're going to have to track all of that in an accounting software. We're a QuickBooks-centric firm, so we use QuickBooks Online with our clients. You're going to need to be able to show like your payroll costs going into that bucket and this money being released each month if you receive that money in advance. So there's some work that's involved with that. As far as budgeting goes, usually the trickiest part of grants in that way is like, are they running the same period as our operating year, or are they on a fiscal grant period? And that throws a lot of people for a loop. But I try to summarize it as, you need to know what has been spent grant to date before the start of your fiscal year, and then what do you plan to spend in your current fiscal year for that budget period? And I guess a third question would be, is that grant going to renew or not? So just simple equation. So that $100,000 award that I gave as an example, what if that started on 10/1 and your calendar year-end operation? Well, generally speaking, you probably have $75,000 of that $100,000 left to spend for whatever you budgeted for in the coming year. I'm just going to start using 2026. Hopefully majority of you can understand the calendar year concept. But if there's a lot of fiscal organizations, please raise your hand and I'll shift gears. But so the only thing that would throw kind of off that simple math would be like if you've got some big direct expenses that were maybe at the front end of a grant. And so maybe, let's just say there was $50,000 of very specific costs that you afforded in the first quarter of that grant, then you'd only have $50,000 that you need to put into the current operating budget for 2026. And what components of the budget is that? Is that personnel? Is that direct expenses, overhead, etc.? So just wanted to be very clear with donations with donor restrictions, and then that timing of when things fall into your operating year versus a grant year. The other thing to be thinking about with grants are cost reimbursement grants. And from two perspectives, in my experience, first, when you're budgeting, you want to know, a cost reimbursement grant is exactly that. You had to spend the money in order to get the revenue. So in theory, these grants don't add any surplus to your budget. Now, there is usually some admin component of that you could say is quote unquote profit or provide surplus, but really that's typically covering, admin salaries or rent or insurance or those sorts of costs. So, for the most part, when you're budgeting those sorts of cost reimbursement grants annually in your operating budget, those should be, I typically see columnar approaches to those sorts of organizations, and they have, zeroing out at the bottom that I'll just use another $100,000 example where $100,000 of revenue comes in, 60,000 of it's salary and benefits, and 30,000 of it is other direct costs, and 10,000 maybe in admin. So that all has to balance itself out. Any early questions about grants? I actually can't see when I'm sharing my slideshow, I can't see the chat. So if anybody wants to.
There's nothing in that yet.
Nothing there. All right, great. All right. So another revenue source is fundraising events. So, the timing of when you can call that true revenue. So like if you're selling tickets, they probably should be deferred revenue until the event happens, assuming you would give out refunds if an event didn't happen. Typically, sponsorships aren't necessarily the same bucket because my experience would say that if for some reason, COVID seems to be a horrible example to have to bring back up, but when that happened and there was an event that was canceled, most sponsors were all in with the organizations and just said, okay, well, just convert that to unrestricted and not specific to the event. So, but most of the time you're going to want to show your sponsorships getting released in the month of the particular event. Silent auctions, all of that as well. So I'm a big proponent of getting a gross figure for your fundraising and then showing the gross expenses to show a net. And then kind of, again, in a columnar manner, seeing how that looks overall. That's kind of money, the unrestricted contributions, hopefully your organization has some ability to raise these sorts of dollars, whether they be from individuals or businesses. But these are the monies with no strings attached. Often I see organizations weighted with this sort of revenue in the latter part of a calendar year, that holiday, people getting in their tax deductions and that sort of approach. So I'm kind of alluding to it, and I'll just jump out of order here a little bit. Like when you're putting together a budget, I do like to see by month how an organization is budgeting, because that gets input into QuickBooks in that way. And then when you're looking at your year-to-date results, you pull up a budget versus actual, comparing your budget year-to-date, and then you should be answering the questions on, okay, why aren't we on track with what we anticipated? So contributions, you should be able to look at the history of what you're raising and kind of anticipate when those dollars are going to come in and spread that into the particular months that you're operating under. I'll just also say this, when putting together a budget overall, unrestricted contributions sometimes becomes the plug in budgets, and that is no good, no bueno. We just, hopes and dreams do not balance a budget. And so I would strongly encourage, that fundraising goals have a plan around them. Are you going to ask your board to help with soliciting certain amounts each year? Do they have minimums that they should contribute individually? What is the plan for getting to that $50,000, $100,000, $200,000, whatever that number is, and make sure that it's just not a plug to balance things. All right, down off my soapbox for a moment. Do you ask for any of your participants to cover some of the costs related to the programs that you run? So program fees, this can, some sort of earned income for what you're doing, usually nominal in the whole scheme of things in my experience, but there could be some significance to this if you're helping with, particular programs, and that's the way you've set them up. So make sure you incorporate those. Some organizations may be lucky enough to have interest income earned. Typically that's unrestricted on cash that's not held for any specific purpose. Interest rates are generally up from 2, 3, 4 years ago. So we are seeing organizations spending a little bit of time pushing money around to money markets and CDs with other institutions than their operating institution to try and maximize some interest. So incorporate that into your budget as best you can, depending on how well think that cash is going to be sitting around rather than being used. And this is a topic for budgeting. I'm a GAAP, generally accepted audit accounting principles budgeter. So I'm accrual based. Distributions from endowments are already monies that you had fundraised for in the past, and so that happened to create the asset that is now kicking off some funds to spend. And so how an organization might show this in its operations is that you put in income for everything that we've already discussed, your expenses, and let's just say you have a deficit of $20,000 showing there. But this organization knows that a $20,000 distribution comes off of its endowment every year. I would leave that $20,000 deficit. That is what your organization will show, minus investment returns, which I don't typically budget for, and will probably, I think that's on a separate slide coming up, but just making a note that this $20,000 deficit would be covered from a cash perspective by a distribution from an endowment. All right. Any other questions on revenues or cash coming in as it relates to budgets? Oh, I popped in the chat. Here we go.
I have a question in the chat.
Yep.
The question is, excuse my ignorance, but with program fees, how does that affect our tax return? Can we actually charge program fees, or do we have to pay taxes on program fees charged to families, even though the fees collected are only a portion of the actual fees?
Yeah, that's a good question. My experience would say that program fees are allowable and that they are, as long as they're related to the mission of the organization, that would not create unrelated business income tax consideration, or what a lot of us refer to in the business as UBIT. So, nominal fees that might be, charged for people to participate in a program might be a way to add a little bit of buffer into your budget. But again, my experience says that, the mission-oriented nature of nonprofits, this is usually nominal in budgets, and a lot of organizations try to not have to do it because, the populations they're serving just don't have the means.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. All right, so maybe another one.
A follow-up question, is it a problem then to send them a receipt stating what they paid?
I mean, it wouldn't be a tax deduction in the sense that they've received services for what they've paid. So usually, in order to get, maybe that's not the gist of the question, but that's what jumps into my head right away. So you can't provide services in exchange and then have that individual, think that they're entitled to a taxable contribution, or a charitable contribution.
Follow up again. Some families ask for a receipt to send to a local organization to help them get reimbursed.
My sense would be that in that case, you'd want to do right by the participant, and if they pay money and then they can somehow get that from somewhere else, that you would want to try and have a mechanism to afford that, to make that happen. It might be easier than to just create a system to take a log of the people that participate in the program and then bill that other entity that those other people would be going to. That's me maybe trying to think too practically, but a lot of back and forth for what would probably be small dollars. If you've got everybody paying and then going someplace to get that money reimbursed, see if there might be a way to synergize.
Thank
All
you.
right.
I will jump in if there's any follow-up questions.
Awesome. All right. Personnel by far is in 90+% of nonprofits, the most important area to know, what are we spending in personnel and what benefits are we providing? How do they fulfill the mission of the organization and how do we pay for them all? I'm going to stay away from the feel good of personnel, and it's not an expense, it's an investment. And, there are HR professionals that can talk with you about that piece of it. I'm just going to talk dollars and cents here and, sound very accountant-like for the moment here. But just to reiterate, reading off the slide here a bit, is it important to the mission? What commitments do we have on our current grants? Are they covered by grant funds or unrestricted dollars? What sort of raises, what sort of cost of living is happening right now? We've been talking with our clients about 3%, 3 to 4% on that cost of living adjustment. Are there any incentives that we can offer? Whether those are actually paid sorts of incentives, or are there non-financial sort of incentives that you can offer that might not be as costly? And then, what's happening with your benefits? I've seen some early results of, well, I'm going to say I've had one client come back to me and say our anticipated health insurance increase that we had budgeted for, it seems like the information we're getting from our benefits broker is coming in right around target. So that's right around 10%. So, so what are we anticipating for changes there? And do we need to consider changing any of our benefits depending on how our funding is going? There's been lots of conversation around federal dollars and, what can we afford as a nonprofit going into this budget year? And frankly speaking, if we've got retirement contributions that we're making on behalf of employees, or, do we have to look at our health insurance contributions? Those are tough conversations that have to happen when tight budgets are happening. But it's better to have them and keep the organization running and, get everybody on board, than have, end up running a deficit and putting ourselves into a financial situation. So personnel in budgeting, hugely important. And this is how I go about it. All right. So creating a schedule of your employees, the current rates that they're being paid. That formatting got a little wonky. That's supposed to just be the year of 2025. In my example, I'm adding a 3% COLA, number of pay periods. This could vary, 12, 24, 26, depending on what your pay structure is. Coming to some annual salaries. We've got FICA Social Security, which is pretty standard, 7.65. You could get very detailed if you wanted to think about, pre-tax contributions that employees make for health insurance, and that cost might come down. But I tend to leave a little bit of cushion in my payroll taxes and my budgets and just use the 7.65 against the wages. State unemployment tax for Wisconsin, figuring out what your rate is on the first 14,000. That's how that's calculated for Wisconsin. And these numbers should all be what the employer portion of the cost is as it relates to each employee. So I've just done very generic, we're covering a fixed amount each month, and then anything above this would be the employee's responsibilities. Every health plan across all my clients is a little bit different. So you need to understand the employer, what the total premium is, what the employee contribution is, and then that leaves what we're going to put in our budget as the employer portion of health insurance, dental, life. Vision is something that's often put into the mix, whether the employer sponsors the plan and covers those premiums, or whether they sponsor the plan and have the employees cover those premiums. But be aware of everything as it relates to benefits. And then retirement, who's eligible, who wasn't eligible last year and might be eligible now if there's a waiting period. Get all of that captured. And, in my example here, we've got a $558,000 of just personnel costs going into 2026 for Awesome Nonprofit Incorporated. Um, alluded to it earlier, like one other thing that would be part of a budget that for a grant funded organization then would be to take each one of these employees and then see where or how they're covered by grant funds, by unrestricted dollars, and then by any other means of fundraising, and just make sure that those are matching up. If there's any sorts of holes in how somebody's funded, you have to decide explicitly, like, are we going to fundraise specifically for them? Are we going to have unrestricted dollars go to them, or do we have to have the tough conversation? So a lot of the ARPA dollars that may have been flowing through some organizations have evaporated or are ending. And, there were some people that were hired with those funds. And, unless you've now found replacement dollars, those are people that might not be, able to continue with the organization unless you found replacement dollars. So, again, understanding how your employees are covered is crucial to budgeting. And I'll leave it at that. Other expenses beyond that. So most grants have other specific costs. You might have printing, you might have subcontractors, other one-time costs. Again, understanding how your grant budget breaks out and it gets woven into your annual budget is an art form, and not everybody's good at it. I think we know how to take and approach each budget that has these sorts of considerations. Basically building the budget by column and getting those in total and then spreading that out over the months. So understanding those grants and these costs and how those, when are they falling? Have they already happened and we've got less money to worry about in the coming operating budget, or are they still yet to be afforded? I alluded earlier to fundraising events, and now you have to anticipate what you're going to get from sponsors and tickets and whatnot. That's your gross income. Now your gross expenses come into play. How much for the venue? How much for the catering? Are you having prizes or 50-50 raffle or anything like that? Making sure you understand all of those costs that are going in. I don't typically budget people's times into the events because those are, that is kind of understood. But if you really wanted to get the true cost of a fundraising event, that would be something to consider. And you could get to that. You'd have basically your personnel line, and then you'd have an allocation of that cost over so it would reduce your personnel cost by, let's say, $10,000, but then you'd end up with that $10,000 in your fundraising event costs. So it'd be kind of potato on that one. Other items that I find are big in budgets. So anything related to occupancy, rent, and utilities. If you do have debt payments, that's a little bit different. Not to get too wonky accounting on you, but if you've got a principal and interest payment on a building loan that's happening, really the interest expense is all that should show up in your operating budget. And then, much like I was describing with the endowment, you basically have to show a surplus to show that you can pay the principal portion of your debt as it relates to an amortized loan, or if you're trying to pay back a line of credit. Like, the only way to pay off debt is to have a surplus budget. And so with my clients, I'm not going to show the entire loan payment in their budget. I'm going to show the interest expense, make sure that they show a surplus, and then have a note that says this surplus will go to afford $24,000 of principal pay down on our current building debt. Other insurances, my recommendation here is to make sure you have a great broker relationship. Sometimes organizations have very specific need. Like, I'm thinking of Big Brothers Big Sisters, because of volunteers working with kids, like, they can only often find one carrier for that sort of insurance, but often more general nonprofits can look around and shop around for professional liability insurance, sport board insurance, errors and omissions. So try and have a relationship with an insurance broker who can help you shop that each year. Printing just seems like it's still out there, even though we're tending to be in a AI electronic world. So understand what you're going to have for a printing budget, stick to it. I feel like those organizations that have printing in the mix often don't budget enough for some reason. And so make sure you understand what that's going to look like. How many pieces are you going to send out? When are you sending out those pieces? And see if you can get with a vendor who can, kind of price you for the year, so that you can have a good budget for that. Contracted services, if any of you are audited or use an outside accounting firm like ours, technology costs, that's one of our biggest costs as a firm, is outsourced IT. Anything again with grants that might have contracted people involved, making sure you capture those costs. Those are some of the bigger non-personnel items that I see in budgets. And then here are some things that I've somewhat covered along the way and just want to emphasize that are budget related, but when it comes to showing a black and white budget, often these things shouldn't be incorporated, but some organizations do. And so I said the first item, when it comes to debt payments, the only way to pay debt is to have a surplus. So the interest expense on an amortized debt service for a building loan, for instance, I would only be showing the interest expense and ensuring that there's a surplus budget that is noted as covering the principal portion of debt. Reserve replacements, not talked about enough. Definitely going to get up on the soapbox here. When you have a building that needs windows in the future, needs a new boiler, needs HVAC replaced in 15 years, not enough organizations think about, setting aside $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 annually for future costs related to a building. And then we hope for a hailstorm to put the shingles onto a new building or on our building. So if you can, and I realize, this is tough with nonprofit budgets and trying to, thoughts of a surplus are tough to think about. But when you have a building, it is best if you can try to budget a surplus and set that money aside for future expenditures. We've talked about cost reimbursement grants. My only point of emphasis here is on an accrual basis, you're going to match up income and expenses. When you submit those expenses for reimbursement, and if it's my experience with government says that sometimes those take 30, 60, 90 days to come through. So how are you going to float those dollars while you're waiting for that money to come back? And so there's two things that come to mind. One is using reserves from past years. If you've somehow been able to build that up, that's different than replacement reserves. These are just operating reserves, rainy day funds, if you will, that can help you float expenses while you're waiting to be reimbursed. The other would be, and some people don't like to think about this, but a line of credit can be a legitimate way to afford expenses in a month that are going to be reimbursed in future months. As long as you use it properly and, take $20,000 to pay a contractor, and then that $20,000 comes in, a month or two later, and then you pay that line of credit down on that $20,000. I think it's an appropriate thing to have if you're a cost reimbursement funded organization. So think about that. Some of the organizations that I work with have the fortune of having multi-year pledges from people. I can say their name. I worked with them a long time, and I love the organization. The Road Home works with homelessness, and they've got an annual breakfast where they're often asking for people to make pledges of up to 5 years. And so understanding the cash flow that might be related to multi-year pledges and what that's going to look like coming into your budget. When you have a multi-year pledge from a GAAP perspective, you book that in total. So if I'm going to give $25,000 a year for 5 years, a grant or I'm sorry, any nonprofit would put a $25,000 asset on the books as a pledge and recognize $25,000 of revenue. What you might show in your budget, well, if you're going to have that event over and over to get those replaced, it's pretty easy to just show like what your current breakfast might or fundraising event might look like. But let's just say you have a one-time event and then those payments are going to trickle in over 5 years. Here again, I would end up showing a deficit because we're not getting new income. We've got that pledged from past years, and then that deficit should be no more than the pledge payments that we're expecting to come in that year to cover the cash, if you will. I hope that makes sense for people. All right, bring it all together, and this is a real condensed version of what a budget could look like. So we've got 2026 budget in the far left column on my screen. Try and do a projection of what your current year is going to look like. So so for instance, like as we're presenting our 26 budgets, soon we'll have October financials closed for our nonprofits, and then take 2 months worth going forward and just kind of estimate, like based on either history or what information you have at your fingertips, how are we going to perform the rest of the year. And then you've got what your budget was, see how you performed against that budget, and a couple of years of prior year actuals. This is just kind of give a litmus for what the organization has done in the past. So this is what we typically share with our nonprofits when we're helping. All right. So now that it's done, the instant a budget's done, it's usually useless. I don't mean to say that and sound defeatist, but things change. Somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, I'm having a baby, and where I'm going to need to take off in September." So what we do with a lot of our nonprofits is take and start projecting forward with new information that comes about. Hey, maybe you're really lucky and you get a new grant that you hadn't anticipated. And what does that look like when you weave it in? And are you adding new personnel costs as a result of that? So you still want to track against that budget that you put forth and see how things are looking. A budget for me is static. With my clients, you do the best you can with the information that you have. Get it approved before the end of the year, before the end of the year, before your next year starts, and then track against it and see what's happening and ask yourself questions on why things are the way they are. Again, try and weight the months with the activity that you're anticipating. Yes, you might have a $400 a month telephone bill. Just put that in that telephone line for each month. But maybe you go and you find a better vendor and then it's $300 a month, and then in the projected column you could show that. So this is what we do after the budget's done, because again, things will change pretty quickly after you've put things in place, and you've got to start anticipating what that's going to look like, and do you have to pivot in any way. Did I talk too fast? Maybe. That was all I had to share on budgeting. I'd be more than happy to answer questions from any of you based on what we just went over, or any other random nonprofit questions as it relates to finance. I'm all yours for the next 15 to 30 minutes, if you like.
All right, thanks so much, Nick. Now I'd like to open it up for questions. So please feel free to either put a question in the chat or go ahead and unmute.
I do have a question.
Great, go ahead.
And that's about budgeting for the fundraising expenses, because you're showing fundraiser revenues, gross revenues, right?
Yep.
Or you're showing net. You're showing gross, right?
I would be showing gross components of each. I would be showing, $100,000 of revenue versus 40,000 of expense nets us $60,000 in my quick example.
And so then wait. In the quick example, so you're showing net? No, but because the way we have it is that we have gross revenues for fundraisers, and then
Mhm.
we show expenses in the expenses side, then we show
Yep.
the expenses for the fundraisers. Okay.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
now on an annual basis, when we're looking at putting together our annual report and coming up with the buckets of program costs versus admin costs versus fundraising, right?
Mhm.
So now we don't want to be in the business where we're a not-for-profit with a mission of literacy. We're not throwing parties. We're not a party, but um, but we've got these expenses in the fundraiser, and it just seems wonky, right?
I understand. I think are you kind of alluding to or concerned about like how your ratios look when you
Correct.
have
Exactly.
events?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a tough one to, so, if you rely on fundraising as part of how you pay for things, your ratios will look less desirable, if you will, or than somebody who's grant funded because you don't have that fundraising expense. But my recommendation to you, you just have to be able to tell the story.
Hmm.
If you've got strong donors who understand how you operate and that that $40,000 that you might again spend raises 100,000 and nets you 60, that's just the cost of doing business. And if our budget is half million, or I'm trying to come up to it with a simple math, so like 400,000, and so that means 10% of our budget is fundraising. 90% of it is still going to, well, I guess you'd still have to look at what's in management in general, but probably,
Right.
75% or more is still going to programming. So,
Hmm. Okay.
you know, in Madison, we've got United Way, and the gold standard has always been kind of like no more than 14% is going to fundraising and admin. But I can tell you operationally, like I've seen 60 cents of a dollar go to programming, and that's just because of the fundraising mechanisms that they have in place that work for them to raise money to do the programming that they do.
Hmm. Okay.
And I agree with you. Yeah, if anybody thinks you're just throwing parties to throw parties, then they don't know your organization well enough.
Right. I mean, yeah, because yes, we're in the business of doing these programs, and that is what we do. But we're a small organization, so about 100,000 a year. And so then you have things like you have expenses for accounting, and that's tax preparation and payroll, and that all goes into admin, right? Um,
For the most part, yes, I would say unless, yeah, the tax return itself and payroll processing, you could probably argue some of the payroll costs should travel with the employees.
hmm.
So if you've got program people, I think you could make a pretty legitimate argument for including some of those as allowable grant costs or program costs. Um, but yeah, for the other example, the tax return itself probably is admin.
Hmm. Okay. 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 Thank you.
Yeah. I want to
Okay.
go back. Kathy had asked, dividing budget into admin and program. Hard to decide what goes into which buckets. Judgments calls as long as as I say why. Um, yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's kind of the same conversation we're having, right? The more you can legitimately call program and tie to the organization delivering on the mission, the better from a optics perspective. I would want you to follow the rules as far as what's really program and what's admin. If you default to like putting something in admin versus program, so that you're not skewing things inappropriately, that would be my, without knowing exactly where your dilemmas are, like I can only speculate. So, but judgment calls work, overall, you're just trying to get to the overall budget in total, for the most part. But having a sense of what your program versus admin breakout is, so that when you do have to answer the question for people that do want to know, you've got that story to tell. Did I answer your question, Kathy?
Yeah, I think so. We found when we were working on our budget last time that our admin seemed so high, but I was including things like, for instance, if we had posters printed to, and we bought the stuff and printed them in our own office to put up to try to recruit tutors and students. I was calling that admin because it's paper and ink and the printer. But can I switch that and call that tutor expenses and put it under program?
What you just described sounds 100% program related. Yeah, so that's just a matter of getting the proper cost allocation methodologies for the organization. How much of that you incorporate into your budgeting, is a matter of how much time you have and how detailed you want to get. But certainly what you just described is program, and the more that you can show in program, the better your organization, generally speaking, looks to outside fundraisers.
Right. And that kind of what goes with that is we got a really large grant that was very vague. It was marketing to get our name into the community, to get more tutors and students. And
marketing is one of those trickier gray areas. Like what I've heard, if it looks and smells like outreach, like where you're trying to, again, if you're trying to recruit tutors or, get the word out that this is the work that we're doing in the community versus like, hey, here's a great event that you can come to, that's more fundraising / admin versus, if you've got a run of ads that are really just saying, hey, we would love to see you become a tutor for our literacy nonprofit. So that one seems like a good reason to also split it if you feel like you can.
Okay. Then and as long as I can justify why I made that decision, it shouldn't be a problem. And then just kind of reflecting with that, if in the past we've counted it as admin, but now we switch it and we're calling it program, is that going to look weird if somebody looks back? Because you can't change last year, right? I mean, it's already done. It's done.
Well, I mean, don't change last year if something like an audit's been completed or an I-90's been completed. But like if you're like in the middle of this year, let's say for 2025, and you're like, you know what, in 2026, we're going to budget this differently because some of it's program, I would absolutely, this is me, go back into 2025 and redistribute costs to program over admin for all the reasons we just described. You're going to look better to outside fundraising, contributors. So, and then that would be easier to explain going forward as well. So those are the two reasons I would do it. Some might argue, don't ever change anything historically in a financial. I only consider a year closed where a 990 or an audit's been done. So, from my client's perspective, most of my clients at this point, 2024 audits are completed, and I won't touch anything in those books. But 2025 is, a little bit of a child that I'm making sure can walk and show what we've done. So I will make changes if it makes sense.
Good. Okay, I'll do that then. Thank you.
Yep. Anna, what is the largest error most often occurring in nonprofits in their budgeting? So I alluded to one of them, putting a plug into unrestricted contributions without a plan for how you're going to get there. It's the biggest flaw that I see in budgets, and will end up with nonprofits being in deficit situations more times than not. Somewhat related, it would be just being overly optimistic on your revenue streams and not knowing, like, that funder gave us 100,000 last year. I'm pretty sure we're getting it this year, so let's put it in. And when I see nonprofits budget well is when they've got a good relationship with their funders, and they go out and just ask them, hey, we're budgeting. Do you think we're going to get that $100,000? And almost getting, an acknowledgement that that's going to continue. And then the last error that I see is like not understanding what's left to spend in your grants that are non-personnel costs. So, you get a $50,000 grant and you're going to use a subcontractor for 25 of that. And nobody thinks of that. Nobody goes back to the original grant budget. Nobody looks at what's been spent year to date on that grant to look at that. And then you end up upside down because you didn't, you put $50,000 of grant expense or income in, and 25 of it was going to cover personnel, but you didn't put that 25 grand of subcontractors in. So those are the errors that I've witnessed that flip my nonprofits budgets. All right, Karen Peterson, is there a certain criteria that warrants a very small nonprofit to obtain professional liability insurance, or should every organization have? Short answer, if you have a board, you should have some sort of errors and omissions. 4,000 seems a lot. I've seen a small nonprofit usually be able to find $1,000 policy. So again, maybe we've got to find a broker who can shop it around. Granted, I haven't been on that board now for a while. It was a volunteer board. But I remember our professional liability or our errors policy for the board being around 1,000. So that didn't seem too cost prohibitive. And, you got to protect the people that are working in the organization in that regard. All right. Christy Gander, how do you determine what portion of expenses is for admin versus program? We were talking a little bit about this with Kathy. It really comes down to understanding, what line items are doing what for the organization. So, there are some accounting rules that you have to follow, that certain things are administrative versus program, but ask yourself if it relates to delivering on the mission. And if you feel strongly about that, then call it program. If you have questions about it, ask an accounting professional, your auditor, or even your tax preparer who might be, breaking your costs into program management and fundraising in your 990. But the less you can have, and I don't want to talk out of both sides of my mouth, because earlier I talked about the fundraising person with their percentages, but generally speaking, the more we have in program, the better we look to the outside world, for anybody who doesn't have a deep understanding of how we operate. Can you refer us to where we might find more user-friendly information on nonprofit budgeting suitable for very small budgets, staff, and capacity? I guess, my thought would be like just even putting something together in Excel is better than nothing. Using some sort of historical perspective. I think budgeting is an exercise for any size organization to make sure, what you are expecting to spend, you've got that either in the bank or can easily raise that in the coming year. Maybe there's a volunteer within the midst of the board who could help at least give some attention to it. But, this will sound very biased, like spending an hour or two with a firm like ours who charges, $200 an hour to do a budget with some of our nonprofits, if that's all we're doing, might be money well spent to understand like where you're at and where you stand. And, that's the worst sales pitch I'll give today, but like, I just, sounds a little self-serving, but I just believe really strongly that the budget is the base from which you start all your operations each year. And somebody has to understand where you're starting from, what to expect, how are we going to fundraise X, Y, and Z, how does it tie into the mission that we're trying to fulfill. So without that financial component feeling strong, everything else, think of the stool, you got to have your finance in order, you got to have your program in order, you got to have your admin in order, your fundraising in order. If any of that's not in order, then people are going to fall off the seat. All right. Now we got a big, what cost allocation method for indirect costs is most effective and compliant for nonprofits with multiple programs? That is a loaded question, and I usually have better educated people on me when it comes to very specific cost allocation. I mean, it's usually around time, right? So we talked about people being our biggest cost in a budget, and so you've got to have time sheets that and hopefully a timekeeping system / payroll processing system that can easily distribute those costs to the grants that are in play. Then you have all of the related personnel costs that go with those that need to track: health insurance, benefits, etc. And then, what costs are, then you go to space, and that's usually square footage. And, right now we're not getting, none of this is effective or efficient, should I say. Like anytime you have grant funding, it's time intensive. And my challenge or my caution to you all would be, like, understand what you're getting into if you're going to take dollars that require lots of cost allocation, because it is a lot of work, and you really do need to have somebody in-house who knows what they're doing, or a firm like ours who's helping you administer and manage those grants. So the best answer I have for that. Somebody's asking about putting a plug in. So a plug for me is just a number that balances. Like, so let's say we have a $500,000 expense budget, and we know that 300,000 of it's covered by grants that we know about and feel very strongly about, or our fundraiser is going to net that much. Well, in my example here, 200,000 is a plug to help us balance our budget. And I don't like the plug. I don't like that unless we know with confidence or understand, like in the past, we've raised 200,000, or, hey, we've got this awesome new development director who's going to go out and raise 200,000, which, by the way, is usually never the case for a new development person. They need some time to acclimate. That's a plug. Thank you, Wisconsin Lit, for adding that. Yes, there is uniform guidance on how to do cost allocations as well. Okay. Actually, this is a question here. Can you speak of when it is okay to charge a finance member into a grant? It's somewhat limited, but it's like anytime that they're helping with reporting back to or on a grant. So when quarterly time comes up to report back on a grant and do a submission or anything like that, that is usually, my experience says that's allowable time specific to a grant. The general, they would also then, be in the overall admin bucket of time. And to some degree, my understanding is that some of that would also be allowable through an admin allocation. But for finance people to be specifically included on grants is, minimal at best. I hope that validates what you're, okay. Sweet, I got it right. Yes.
Thank you so much. We have time maybe for one, maybe two more questions. So I'll just invite participants one last time. Are there any more questions that you'd like to put in the chat? Or if you would like to come off of mute and share your question.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw my contact information up one more time too at the end of my slide deck here. I'd be more than happy to answer questions. I'm really good about responding to emails, especially for any of you that are going into your next calendar year and are doubting how you're putting together just have questions about how you're putting together your budget and want a outside perspective, second set of eyes. If it takes me 10 minutes and I give you 2 points, I'm not going to charge anything for that. But if, we want to be more involved or you want more help, we can talk about what that looks like. But, our heart and soul is helping the nonprofit community. So, and like I said, budgeting from my perspective is the base from which all nonprofits need to start their year. And even if you don't get all of the numbers right, it's a time to think about like what's important for us to achieve in the coming year and how are we going to pay for it. And hopefully some people have some sense of, okay, yeah, we need these costs and this personnel, and here's how we're going to pay for all of that. Put it together. Hopefully it's pretty close to balanced. We didn't talk anything about deficit spending. I have worked with nonprofits who have past operating reserves built up and go into the coming year with a deficit spend because they just feel like it's necessary. An example would be anybody who's working with food security. Food costs went up extensively, higher demand because of things like SNAP being delayed or cut or, again, federal dollars being weird right now. They knew that they would have more demand for their services. They accepted that they were going to do a deficit budget because they were going to they were going to do whatever it took to make sure that people had food on their table. So they passed a deficit budget. They know that going into next year, they probably can't do that, but they had the reserves to do it this year. And they felt like, well, rather than have that rainy day fund, again, we're going to use it. That's what this rainy day fund is for.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nick. This was just so fantastic and informative, really helpful. For participants, please complete the survey that will pop up at the end of the Zoom meeting. So as we alluded to in other sessions, we're trying something new. So we added the survey directly to the Zoom session. When you leave the session today, you'll see a message that says, please click continue to participate in the survey. We would really encourage you to do so. That really helps us plan professional development opportunities that resonate and that are relevant and needed in your work. So thank you all again for attending the session, Budgeting for Small Nonprofits. Our next training, the last one of our fall conference for today, is Building Community, Leveraging Teachers for Accessibility and Inclusion. It starts in a few minutes here at 3:30. So I hope to see many of you there. Thank you again, Nick. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, have a good night, everyone.
Nick, bye-bye.